The lawyer hadn't even finished his sentence. He was midway through explaining the terms of Mom's estate, something about the property valuation and the way assets would be divided, when my younger sister, Denise, slammed her hand flat on the conference table and said it. "Of course you'd take more. You've always been greedy." The room went completely still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop spinning for a second. I felt the words land in my chest like a punch I hadn't seen coming. My hands tightened around the leather notebook sitting in my lap, Mom's notebook, and I made myself breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The way Mom used to tell me to do when things felt too big. I hadn't agreed to anything yet. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Hargrove who had handled Mom's affairs for years, hadn't even gotten to the part about what I was or wasn't receiving. He was still talking in the slow, careful way that lawyers talk when they're trying to make sure everyone understands before anyone reacts. But Denise had already decided the story. And in that story, I was the villain. I looked across the table at her. She was wearing a black blazer, her hair styled the way she always styled it when she wanted to seem put together. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment, like she had practiced that line in the mirror of her hotel room the night before. Then she leaned forward and added 5 more words. "Mom warned me about you." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, not sadness, something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing, the feeling of finally reaching a limit you didn't know you had until you hit it. I looked down at the notebook. Mom's handwriting on the cover, her name on the inside flap, 6 years of her life in my hands. I opened it. "My name is Carol Whitaker. I am 52 years old. I have been a registered nurse for 26 of those years, and for the last 6 of them, I was also something else. My mother's full-time caregiver, part-time cook, midnight nurse, appointment scheduler, insurance fighter, and the person who held her hand through every bad day she had. My mother, Ruth Whitaker, passed away 4 months ago from complications related to heart failure. She was 78. She had been declining slowly for years before the final stretch, and that final stretch was hard in ways that people who haven't lived through it can't fully understand. Denise is 4 years younger than me. She lives in Atlanta, about 6 hours away from the small house in Greensboro, North Carolina, where Mom spent the last decade of her life. Denise works in marketing. She has a nice apartment, a social life, and a very active Instagram account where she posts inspirational quotes and, every so often, a smiling photo taken during one of her holiday visits to see Mom. Those photos always got a lot of likes. People commented things like, "Family goals," and "So sweet," and "Your mom is so lucky to have you." I never commented anything. I was usually too busy to be on my phone. There were medications to sort, doctor's appointments to prepare for, insurance claims to dispute, and dinners to cook, because Mom had stopped being able to stand at the stove for more than a few minutes without getting dizzy. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I made choices. I could have said no. I could have pushed harder for Denise to take more responsibility. There were years when I told myself the situation would get better, that Denise would step up, that it was temporary. It never got better. Denise never stepped up, and it was never temporary. But I stayed quiet. I kept my head down. I did the work because the work needed doing, and Mom needed someone, and I was the someone who showed up. For 6 years, I stayed quiet. Today, in this conference room with its beige walls and Mr. Hargrove's careful voice and Denise's rehearsed fury, that was going to change. Mom had kept that notebook by her bedside for as long as I could remember. It was a simple thing. Dark brown leather cover, slightly worn at the corners, with a thin elastic band that held it closed. She had gone through several notebooks over the years, filling them up and starting new ones, but this particular one she had started about 3 years before she passed, and it was the one she kept coming back to. I had seen her writing in it many times. Sometimes early in the morning when the light was still gray and thin and she hadn't yet asked me to help her up. Sometimes in the evening after dinner when the television was on low and she thought I was washing dishes. She wrote in it with a blue pen, pressing firmly because her hands had started shaking a little in the last couple of years, and she had to be deliberate with each letter. I never read it while she was alive. It wasn't mine to read. Whatever was in it was hers, and I respected that the same way I respected the other private things she kept. The box under her bed, the folded letters in her dresser drawer, the old photographs she never explained. Denise never touched the notebook. I'm not sure she ever noticed it. After Mom passed, I found it exactly where it always was, on the nightstand, closed with the elastic band, the blue pen tucked underneath it. I picked it up and held it for a long time before I carried it home. I didn't open it right away. It took me nearly 3 weeks before I finally sat down at my kitchen table one afternoon and started reading. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about the last 6 years. Mom had been documenting everything: dates, times, conversations, promises made and broken, her own thoughts, written in her careful, deliberate handwriting about what was happening around her and what she was feeling about it. She had sticky tabs on certain pages, little colored strips that marked sections she had organized carefully. I had noticed one section in particular: names written at the top of each page, people she wanted to write about separately. I had found my name. I had found Denise's name. I had brought the notebook to the meeting because something told me I might need it. Now, sitting across from Denise and her cold accusation, I flipped to the section with the sticky tabs. I turned past my own pages. I found the page with Denise's name written at the top in Mom's careful blue ink. Denise watched me from across the table. She leaned forward slightly, her confident expression flickering just a little at the edges, like a candle in a draft. She was suddenly noticeably nervous. I smoothed the page flat with my palm, and I began. I read slowly. That was important. I didn't rush or skip or summarize. I read Mom's exact words, in her exact voice, the way she would have wanted them heard, measured and clear and without apology. Denise believes love is shown in appearances, not actions. She sends flowers but doesn't answer calls. She posts photos but doesn't ask real questions. She loves the idea of being a good daughter more than she loves doing the work of being one. I looked up. Denise's face had gone pale, the kind of pale that happens fast, like the blood just drains straight out in one sudden rush. Her mouth was open slightly. She wasn't moving. Mr. Hargrove, who had been quietly reviewing papers on his side of the table, looked up over the top of his reading glasses. Denise recovered just enough to straighten in her chair and part her lips like she was going to say something. She didn't say anything. I looked back down at the notebook. Mom's words continued for 2 full pages about Denise. She wrote with a mixture of love and exhaustion and deep disappointment that made my chest ache, because I recognized every single thing she described. I had lived alongside these things. I had watched them happen and said nothing, because saying something would have started a fight I didn't have the energy to have, while also managing blood pressure medication schedules and physical therapy appointments. Mom wrote about a Christmas visit where Denise had arrived late, spent most of her time on her phone, complained that the house smelled like medicine, and left 2 days early. She wrote about it plainly, without embellishment. She wrote down what was said and what wasn't said, and how she had felt lying in bed that night after Denise's rental car pulled out of the driveway. I kept reading. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that, by how steady my voice was. I had expected to feel shaky or emotional. Instead, I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in a very long time, like something that had been wound tight inside me for years was finally, slowly unwinding. The lawyer quietly asked me to continue, so I did. The pages kept going, and every page said something true. Mom had been watching everything. She had been forming opinions and documenting feelings and carefully, quietly keeping a record of what was real and what was performance. She had done it not out of bitterness, I don't think, because the entries weren't angry. They were thoughtful. Sometimes they were sad, but they were honest in the way that only a person who has accepted a difficult truth can be honest. She wrote about the missed calls. Not all of them. She wasn't counting obsessively, but specific ones. Times when she was in the hospital or recovering from a procedure, and Denise hadn't called for days. Times when Denise had promised to come, and then canceled, and the reason given didn't quite match things Denise had posted on social media that same weekend. She wrote about canceled visits. 3 in the last 2 years of Mom's life. Visits that Denise had scheduled, that Mom had prepared for, that I had known about, because Mom would quietly brighten in the days leading up to them. And then Denise would call and something had come up, and Mom would tell me in a very even voice that Denise wasn't coming after all. And then she would go quiet for a day or two. Mom didn't write about those stretches of quiet directly. She didn't have to. Anyone reading could fill in what they meant. Denise interrupted once. She said, "That is completely out of context," and her voice was sharp and too loud for the small conference room. But she didn't explain what context we were missing. She didn't point to a specific line and say, "Here, this is what you're not understanding." She just said it, the way people say things when they don't have a real answer. Mr. Hargrove looked at her over his glasses. Then he turned back to me and quietly asked me to continue. And that was the moment I understood that this notebook was not just documentation of the past. It was changing the shape of today. Mr. Hargrove was the kind of man who didn't show surprise easily. I had met him twice before. Once when Mom first retained him years ago, and once when she had a minor legal question about her insurance policy. Both times he had struck me as careful and thorough, someone who read everything twice before he spoke about it once. So when he asked to see the notebook, setting aside the formal documents in front of him and extending his hand across the table with a quiet, professional patience, I paid attention. I handed it to him. He took his time. He wasn't just flipping through. He was reading. He turned pages slowly, pausing here and there. He had a yellow legal pad beside him, and once in a while he made a small note on it. Just a word or a number, something to flag a detail. Denise sat very still on her side of the table. She had stopped interrupting. I noticed her hands were folded in front of her, pressed flat against the table in a way that looked deliberate, like she was working to keep them from doing something else. Then Mr. Hargrove stopped turning pages. He was near the back of the notebook, past the tabbed sections in the later entries that Mom had written in the final months of her life. He read something, went back and reread it, and then looked up at both of us over the rim of his glasses. "There's a reference here," he said carefully, "to an addendum." The word sat in the air between us. I didn't know what addendum he was referring to. I had read the notebook thoroughly, but legal language wasn't something I focused on during those readings. I had been reading it emotionally, not legally. Denise's posture changed. Her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Her jaw shifted. "What addendum?" I asked. Mr. Hargrove glanced at Denise before he answered me. Denise stiffened. Mr. Hargrove set the notebook down and opened the file folder he had brought to the meeting. He went through it carefully. The way a man goes through papers when he is very sure of what he is looking for, and equally sure he will find it. He pulled out a thin set of documents that were stapled together in the upper left corner and set them on the table in front of him. "Your mother updated her will," he said. The update was made and properly notarized approximately 3 months before her passing. The room was very quiet. "I received this update directly from your mother at a meeting she requested. She came alone." He paused. She was clear that she didn't want either of you present for that meeting. I felt the weight of that. Mom had gone to see her lawyer alone. She had gone deliberately, without telling me or Denise, and made changes to her will, and she had done it 3 months before she died, when she still had enough strength to drive herself to the office. She had planned this. "I wasn't aware of any changes," I said quietly. "Neither was I," Denise said. But her voice didn't sound surprised, it sounded careful, which is a different thing entirely. Mr. Hargrove looked at her for a moment before he spoke again. "The addendum significantly adjusts the distribution outlined in the original will," he said. "I think we should review it carefully together before discussing implications." Denise's hand moved on the table. She shifted in her chair. Then, abruptly, she said, "Maybe we should stop here. Schedule another time. I need my own attorney present before we go any further with this." Mr. Hargrove looked at her steadily. "You are, of course, entitled to that," he said, "but I would encourage you to hear the terms first." Denise looked at the door, then at me, then back at the lawyer. She didn't say stop again. Before Mr. Hargrove could continue with the addendum, Denise turned to me. It was a shift I had seen before. The moment when a person realizes the ground is moving under them and decides to go on a fence instead of trying to find their footing. She looked at me directly and her voice changed from careful to hard. "You manipulated her," she said. "You were there every day. You controlled everything she did. You isolated her from me, and now you've set this up so that you get everything and I get nothing. This is exactly what I was afraid of." She wasn't crying. She said it coldly, with the flat certainty of someone stating obvious facts. I felt the heat of it. I won't pretend I didn't. Because being accused of manipulating my dying mother, of isolating her, of orchestrating things for my own gain, hit a place in me that was still raw and tender, and hadn't finished grieving. I had given 6 years. I had given nights and weekends and holidays and my own health and my own social life. And here was the summary Denise had built from all of it. I opened my mouth, then I closed it, because I realized something important. I didn't need to defend myself. Not in that moment, not with words. Mr. Hargrove's expression hadn't changed during Denise's speech. He was watching her with the particular kind of stillness that professionals cultivate when they are trying to remain neutral in the middle of something that is not neutral at all. Then he picked up the stapled documents and opened them. "These are your mother's words," he said quietly, "not Carol's." He held up the first page so we could both see the signature at the bottom. Ruth Whitaker, in her handwriting, with the notary stamp beside it. Denise looked at the signature. Something in her face moved. Just a flicker. But I saw it. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Mr. Hargrove read the key portion of the addendum aloud. It was 2 paragraphs. Not long. Mom had never been a person who used 10 words when 3 would do. The house, the 3-bedroom ranch house in Greensboro where I had spent the last 6 years showing up every day, was to go to me. Not split, not shared, not divided between Denise and me with some complicated arrangement about buyouts or percentage ownership. To me, completely, solely. Denise laughed when he finished reading. It was a short, sharp sound, not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh people produce when they are trying to make pain sound like contempt. "Of course she did," Denise said. "Of course." She shook her head and looked at the ceiling and then looked back at me like I had done something to her personally. Like I had written those words myself and forged our mother's signature underneath them. I didn't respond. I didn't feel what I expected to feel, which was triumph. I felt something quieter than that. I felt the weight of what the house meant, the weight of all those mornings and evenings and middle-of-the-night moments that had happened inside it. I felt Mom in it, the way you feel someone who is gone, like a warmth in a room that doesn't quite match the temperature. Mr. Hargrove had set the documents down again. He was watching both of us. "There's more," he said. Denise stopped laughing. She looked at him. I looked at him. The room went quiet again. In that particular way, it had been going quiet all morning, not peacefully, but with the specific tension of people waiting to find out what comes next. Mr. Blay Hargrove turned to the second page of the addendum and began to read again. Mom had not simply taken things away from Denise. That was the part that surprised me, and I think the part that surprised Denise most of all. Because what came next wasn't a punishment, exactly. It was something more considered than that. It was the kind of thinking that only comes from someone who has had years to watch a situation and decide very carefully what would be fair. Denise was still named in the will. She was still set to receive a portion of the financial assets, the savings account, the investment account that Dad had started decades ago and Mom had continued adding to over the years. That portion was real and significant. It wasn't nothing. But it came with conditions. Mr. Hargrove read them in his calm, measured way. The inheritance would be released to Denise only upon confirmation that certain obligations had been met during the period of Mom's care. He paused after reading that sentence and let it sit for a moment before he continued. Then he looked up and asked a simple question, directed at Denise. "Did you meet these requirements?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Denise looked at him, then at me, then at her hands on the table. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She didn't say anything at all. The silence stretched out past the point where a person who had met the requirements would have spoken. If Denise had attended every required visit, made every required contribution, been present for every required decision, she would have said so immediately. She would have had documents of her own. She would have been ready. She wasn't ready. She sat there in her black blazer with her carefully styled hair, and she said nothing. And that silence said everything that needed to be said. Mr. Hargrove continued reading. The requirements were specific. Mom had not written them vaguely or left them open to interpretation. She had written them the way a woman who had spent 6 years being disappointed writes things when she finally decides to stop hoping and start documenting. Monthly visits, not holiday visits. Not whenever it was convenient visits. Monthly. Every month. Consistent and planned and followed through on. Participation in medical decisions. This meant being present, in person or by video call, at minimum, for significant medical conversations. It meant knowing the names of Mom's doctors, knowing what medications she was on and why. Being part of the discussions that happened when things changed, which in the last 3 years of Mom's life was often. Shared financial support, a monthly contribution to the cost of Mom's care. Medications, the supplemental home health aide who came twice a week, the equipment that made Mom's life more manageable. The amount specified was not large. It was reasonable. It was the kind of amount that someone with Denise's salary could send without noticing. And then Mr. Hargrove said the part that made Denise go still in a new way. There are logs, he said. Your mother kept records. And she provided copies to me at the time of the addendum. He pulled another set of papers from the folder and set them on the table. Visit logs. Call logs. A copy of the financial records showing contributions, or the absence of them. Signed, dated, documented. Every single entry. Mom had built a case. She had done it quietly over time, with the methodical patience of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. The monthly visits, Denise had made 4 in the last 3 years, 4 out of 36. The medical participation. Denise's name appeared twice in the contact logs, twice in 3 years of significant health decisions. The financial contributions, 0. Not one transfer, not one check. The numbers were right there on the page, and they didn't lie. Mom had kept records of more than just the visits. I already knew she was thorough. I had read the notebook after all. But as Mr. Hargrove laid additional papers on the table, I began to understand just how thorough she had been. This wasn't a casual record-keeping habit. This was deliberate, organized, the kind of documentation a person puts together when they have decided that someday someone is going to need to know the truth. There were printed phone records, not Mom's own line, but a separate log she had kept by hand, cross-referencing her call history with a journal of conversations. She noted who called, when they called, how long they talked, and in some entries, a brief note about what was discussed or what was promised. There were bank statements, highlighted in yellow, showing the months and the account activity. The highlights were not mine. Mom had made them herself and then made copies for the lawyer's file. And there were text messages. Screenshots that Mom had printed out, a bit blurry at the edges the way printed phone screenshots always are, but legible. Promises, arrangements, plans that were made and then quietly dropped. Denise said, "This isn't fair." She said it in a different voice than before, not the cold, confident voice she had used when she called me greedy, and not the careful voice she had used when she suggested stopping the meeting. This was a smaller voice, something underneath the performance. Mr. Hargrove looked at her. "These records were compiled by your mother," he said simply. "She chose what to document and what to include in the file she provided to me." Denise shook her head. She was sick. She didn't understand what she was doing. Carol influenced her. These documents predate many of Carol's documented activities as caregiver, Mr. Hargrove said. He said it without inflection. He wasn't defending me. He was just stating what was in front of him. Denise looked at the highlighted bank statements. Her jaw tightened. I watched her and felt for the first time something close to sadness. Not for myself, for how far this had gone. Then Mr. Hargrove said something none of us expected. He had been working through the documents in order, methodically, logically, and I had assumed we were getting close to the end of it. that we were approaching the point where the terms would be summarized and the meeting would be concluded and we would all leave to process what had happened. But he set down the financial records and picked up something else from the folder. A small envelope, sealed, with no return address. Just 2 names written on the front in Mom's handwriting. Carol and Denise. He held it up. Your mother also left this, he said. She asked me to present it only once both of you were in the room together, and only after the terms of the addendum had been explained. There was a long pause. She anticipated, Mr. Hargrove said, choosing his words carefully, that this meeting might be difficult, and she wanted to speak to both of you directly, in her own words. Denise's eyes moved to the envelope. She straightened in her chair. I want to read it first, she said, privately, before Carol sees it. Her voice had a familiar firmness in it, the kind she used when she was trying to establish control of something before it got away from her. I looked at the envelope, at Mom's handwriting, at both our names, side by side, the way they had been side by side for our entire lives, even when everything else had fallen apart between us. No, I said. It was the first direct word I had said to Denise all morning. No, we read it together. Denise opened her mouth. Together, I said again, quietly. That's what Mom wanted. Mr. Hargrove held the envelope in the middle of the table. After a moment, Denise said nothing further. He handed it to me. I opened the envelope carefully. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on the cream-colored stationery Mom had kept in her desk drawer for as long as I could remember. The kind with thin lines and a small floral border at the top that she used for important things. Birthday cards. Thank you notes. And now this. Her handwriting was more unsteady than it had been in the early pages of the notebook. The last few months had been hard on her hands, but the words were clear. She had taken her time. I read it aloud. Mom's voice came back into the room as I read. Not literally, but the way it does when a person you love has written something that sounds exactly like them. The rhythm of her sentences. The words she chose. The particular way she had of being direct without being cruel. She wrote about love first. She said she loved both of us fully and separately, and in ways that were not comparable to each other. Because we were not the same people and had never been. She said she did not want either of us to misunderstand what she had done as a rejection. Then she wrote about disappointment. She said she had spent years hoping Denise would find her way to showing up differently, and that she had finally accepted that hope alone couldn't change what a person wasn't ready to change. She called me her anchor. She wrote that word plainly. Carol has been my anchor. She wrote that she knew I hadn't been perfect, that I had been frustrated and tired and sometimes distant, but that I had stayed. She said staying, when everything in you wants to leave, is the deepest kind of love there is. Then she addressed Denise directly. She called her my greatest worry, not her greatest disappointment. Her greatest worry. There was tenderness in the distinction, and I felt it. She said she worried about what Denise was building her life around, and whether it would hold. When I reached that line, Denise broke. Not with anger this time. She put her hands over her face, her shoulders dropped, and she cried, quietly, in a way that had nothing performed about it. I kept reading. The next part of Mom's letter was the hardest to read aloud. I had to pause once, find my breath, and continue. She wrote about the will. She explained in her steady and careful way that the changes she had made were not made out of anger. She said she had thought about them for a long time. Longer, she wrote, than either of us would probably guess. She said she had watched and waited and hoped to be wrong about what she was seeing. Then she wrote about the requests Denise had made. She mentioned it without ceremony, just stated it as a fact among other facts. Denise asked me twice to revise my will in her favor. The first time was about 2 years before my passing. The second was approximately 8 months before. Both times she came to me alone, without Carol's knowledge. I stopped reading. I looked up at Denise. Her hands were still over her face. She didn't look up. I wasn't aware of those conversations, I said. I wasn't saying it accusingly. I was just acknowledging it aloud because hearing Mom write about something I hadn't known was disorienting in a specific way. It made the years reorganize themselves around a new fact. Denise lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. That's not how it happened. she said quietly. I wasn't trying to cut you out. I was just worried. I thought you had too much influence. She said it like she believed it. Maybe she did. But the letter kept going. Mom had anticipated this too. She had written directly after the mention of those conversations, "I am including proof of these meetings." Mr. Hargrove reached into the folder one more time. There were 2 documents. Printed emails. Denise had written to Mom about the will, and Mom had kept the printouts. Denise looked at them and went quiet. I thought we were at the end of it. I thought the letter and the logs and the documents were the whole picture, and that now we would move into whatever came next. The formal legal process, the paperwork, the separate conversations each of us would need to have with our own people when we got home. Then Mr. Hargrove opened a different section of the folder. He set 3 pages on the table. Bank records. Not Mom's general account summary. These were specific transaction records, pulled from a particular time period and highlighted in a way that was different from the yellow highlights Mom had made on her own copies. These highlights were red. "I need to bring something to your attention," Mr. Hargrove said. His tone had shifted. It wasn't warm or careful in the same way anymore. It was professional in a different, more precise way. During the review of your mother's financial records in preparation for probate, several withdrawals were identified that require clarification. He turned the pages toward us. The withdrawals were significant. Not enormous in isolation, but consistent, made over a period of about 18 months, in amounts that were large enough to notice but small enough, perhaps, to seem explainable. A few $100 here, 1,000 there, spread across a year and a half. They were authorized through secondary access on Mom's account. The name associated with that secondary access was Denise. My stomach dropped. Not because I was surprised, exactly. Some part of me had been aware, without letting myself fully look at it, that things hadn't added up. Mom had mentioned being short on bills twice in a period when her income had been steady. I had filled in the gaps myself without asking too many questions, because that's what I did. I looked at Denise. She was staring at the pages. She wasn't crying anymore. She was very still. "What is this?" I asked. But I already felt the shape of what it was. Denise looked up from the bank records. She was composing herself. I could see the effort of it, the particular way her face tightened and then deliberately loosened when she was deciding what version of herself to present. "She gave me that money," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced. She said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed for a while, just in case. She knew I was having a rough stretch financially. She offered. I didn't ask for it. She looked at me directly when she said the last part, like anticipating that I would argue it. I didn't argue it. I looked at the dates on the bank records instead. The first withdrawal was dated 14 months before Mom passed. I recognized that month. It was the month Mom had called me, slightly worried, to ask whether I thought her medication costs were going to go up. She had seemed confused about her account balance. I had helped her call the insurance company, thinking she was misremembering things. She wasn't misremembering things. The second cluster of withdrawals corresponded with the 2 weeks that Mom had told me she couldn't afford to get the handrail installed on the bathroom wall. A simple safety modification that would have cost about $300. I had paid for it myself and told her not to worry. The third set fell in a month when Denise had not visited. When she had canceled a planned trip and told Mom something had come up at work. I looked at the dates and I looked at Denise's composed face, and I felt the room get very cold. Mr. Hargrove's voice was different now. Measured, yes, but with a precision that hadn't been there before. "Are there any documents confirming your mother's consent to these specific withdrawals?" he asked. Denise said, "I'm sure there's something." "Do you have access to anything like that?" she said. "I'd need to look." The room stayed cold. Mr. Hargrove laid his pen down on the legal pad. He did it quietly, the way a person sets something down when they want to give their full attention to what comes next. "I want to be clear with both of you," he said. "My role today has been to explain the terms of Ruth Whitaker's estate and facilitate this review. What I'm about to say goes slightly beyond that role, but I feel it would be irresponsible not to say it." He looked at Denise steadily. "If the withdrawals from your mother's account were not clearly and explicitly authorized. Documented authorization, separate from general account access, then this matter could extend well beyond estate proceedings. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is a serious legal issue. It can involve civil penalties and, in some cases, criminal review. The room was very quiet. Denise's calm cracked, not completely, but around the edges, in the places where the surface becomes too thin to hold. She turned to me. Her voice went sharp in the way things go sharp when a person is cornered and doesn't know what else to do with what they're feeling. "You love this," she said. "Don't you? You think you've won something." I hadn't said a single word. I had been sitting quietly, listening to the lawyer explain things that were in documents that existed before I entered this room. I hadn't accused her. I hadn't demanded anything. I had simply been present while the truth unfolded in the order Mom had arranged it. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Grief. The same grief I had been carrying around for 4 months since we buried Mom, but bigger now. Wider. Because now it wasn't just grief for the woman who was gone. It was grief for everything that had been lost between the two of us long before she left. "I don't think I've won anything," I said. And I meant it. Denise wasn't finished. Even after everything that had been laid on that table, the notebook, the letter, the logs, the bank records, the lawyer's clear and level explanation of what could come next, she wasn't finished. She leaned forward in her chair, and her voice came back up to that hard, flat tone from earlier in the morning. The tone she had opened with. The one that had started all of this. "You think you're better than me because you stayed," she said. "You've always held it over me. Your whole life, you've acted like staying made you a better person, a better daughter. Like you were sacrificing yourself on some altar, and the rest of us were just selfish for having our own lives." She stopped, breathing, waiting. It was the most honest thing she had said all morning. I let it sit there for a moment. Then I answered her. Not the hard parts. Not the parts about the bank records, or the visits she didn't make, or the conversation she had with Mom about changing the will without telling me. I didn't answer any of that. I answered the thing underneath all of it. The thing that had been underneath all of it for years. "No," I said. I kept my voice even. Not cold. Just steady. "I didn't stay because I thought I was better than you, Denise. I didn't stay because I wanted to hold something over your head. I stayed because someone had to. I stayed because she was our mother and she needed someone every single day. Not just on holidays and not just for the photos. I stayed because I couldn't leave her." I paused. "I never once asked you to stay with me. I never once said you had to. That was your choice to make, just like staying was mine." The room was completely silent. Mr. Hargrove was looking at his legal pad, not writing, just looking. Denise was looking at me. The silence stretched out, and in that silence, something changed. I couldn't have told you exactly what it was. But the air in the room felt different after those words, as if the weight had shifted, redistributed, landed somewhere more honest than where it had been sitting all morning. Near the back of the notebook, past the sections with the sticky tabs, past the documented records of calls and visits and financial contributions and medical decisions, there was one more page. I had found it weeks ago when I first read through the whole thing. It was the last entry Mom had made. The handwriting was less steady than the earlier pages, smaller and more deliberate, the way writing becomes when it takes effort just to hold the pen. There was no date on it, just the words. I hadn't planned to read it aloud. I hadn't planned to share it in the meeting. But something about the silence that had settled in the room after my response to Denise made me reach for the notebook one more time. I opened it to the back. The last entry was short, 4 sentences. I read them quietly. "I have done what I can. I have said what I need to say. The rest belongs to them now. I hope the truth frees them both." I closed the notebook. Something happened in me when I closed it. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way things settle when you have been holding something heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down in the right place. A kind of quietness that wasn't empty. Something that had room to breathe. Denise was looking at the table. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't performing anything. She was just sitting there, in the aftermath of all of it, looking at the wood grain of the conference table with her hands flat in her lap. Mr. Hargrove gave us a moment. Then he picked up his pen, wrote a final note on his legal pad, and began to explain what the formal next steps would look like. The probate timeline, the release of assets, the separate matter of the financial review that would need to be addressed through its own process. I listened. I took mental notes. I would call my own attorney when I got home, but mostly I sat with Mom's last words and felt, for the first time since she passed, something close to peace. The formal part of the meeting ended about 20 minutes after I closed the notebook. Mr. Hargrove summarized the situation plainly. Denise's portion of the financial inheritance would be significantly reduced, not eliminated, but reduced, because the conditions Mom had set had not been met. The visit logs, the participation records, and the financial contribution records all confirmed what the notebook had described. It was documented. It was clear. As for the house, that was settled. It belonged to me. The financial discrepancies in Mom's account were a separate matter. Mr. Hargrove explained that he was professionally obligated to flag them during the probate review and that a separate evaluation would be conducted. He said this without drama, without accusation, in the same level tone he had maintained throughout the entire meeting. Denise didn't respond when he said it. She had gone quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the strategic quiet of someone choosing not to say something, but the quiet of someone who has run out of things to say. She sat in her chair, and she looked smaller than she had when she walked in that morning. Not defeated in the way that is satisfying to watch, just smaller, like something had been taken out of her that she hadn't realized she was depending on. I understood what it was. She had come into that room with a story. The story was that she was the wronged party, that I had taken advantage, that our mother had been manipulated, and that Denise was the one who saw clearly while everyone else was fooled. That story was gone now. Not because I had taken it from her, because Mom had taken it from her. Quietly, methodically, over the last 3 years of her life. Mom had seen to it herself. I gathered my things when Mr. Hargrove concluded. I picked up the notebook and put it back in my bag. I thanked him for his time. He shook my hand and said he would be in touch with the formal documentation. Then I walked toward the door. Denise caught up with me in the parking lot. I heard her heels on the pavement behind me, that quick, purposeful sound, and I stopped walking and turned around. The afternoon sun was bright after the dim conference room, and I had to squint a little to see her clearly. She looked different outside. The conference room had contained everything and given it a kind of formal structure. Out here, in the light, she just looked like my sister. 4 years younger than me. A person I had shared a childhood with, who had sat across from me at Christmas tables and birthday dinners, and at the back of a church 6 months ago when we buried our mother. She stopped a few feet away from me. The approach she made now was different from anything she had tried inside. No cold accusations, no performing for the lawyer. She stood there in the afternoon sun, and she let her face do something it almost never did. She let it be uncertain. "You know I loved her," she said. "I know you don't believe that, but I need you to know it." Her voice was quiet. The tears weren't performed this time either. They were the kind that happen because the body has been holding something for too long. I looked at her. "I believe you loved her," I said. It was true. I did believe it. Love and presence are not the same thing, and the absence of one doesn't erase the existence of the other. Denise had loved our mother in the way she was capable of loving, which was from a distance, in gestures, in the occasional call, in the idea of being a good daughter, even when the actual work of it felt too hard or too inconvenient or too far from her life. That was a smaller love than Mom deserved. It was a smaller love than Mom needed. But it was real. "I just don't think it was enough," I said. I didn't say it cruelly. I said it the way Mom might have said it, plainly, with the kind of honesty that doesn't require someone to hurt more than necessary. Denise nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We stood there for a moment in the parking lot, 2 sisters and the enormous weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't, and then I turned and walked to my car. On the drive back to Greensboro, I had a lot of time to think. 6 hours is a lot of road and a lot of silence, and I used both. I went through it all. Not obsessively, not in the circular way that keeps you stuck, but in the deliberate way of someone trying to understand what has just happened and what it means for what comes next. There were things I could still do. I could push harder on the financial discrepancies. I could talk to my attorney about whether there was a civil case worth pursuing, not because I needed the money, but because the principle of it was real and the damage to Mom had been real. I could document everything on my end, build a separate file, put pressure on the process. I thought about it seriously for probably an hour of that drive. Then I thought about Mom's last words in the notebook. I hoped the truth frees them both. Not just me. Both. I thought about Denise in that parking lot with the sun in her eyes and the performances stripped away. The uncertain face, the smaller voice, the love that was real but had never been enough. Denise wasn't a monster. She was a person who had made choices, repeatedly, consistently, over years, that prioritized her comfort over her responsibilities. That was a failure. It had consequences. Those consequences were now happening. But pushing further, filing claims, escalating, turning this into a prolonged legal battle, would cost me things I wasn't willing to spend. Time, energy. The specific kind of peace I had felt when I closed that notebook. When I got back to Greensboro that evening, I called her. She picked up on the second ring. "What happens next," I said, "is up to you. If the review finds something that needs to be addressed, you'll need to address it. I'm not going to push, but I'm also not going to cover for you." She didn't say thank you. I didn't expect her to. But she said okay. That was enough. The first morning I woke up in Mom's house, as mine, officially, legally, completely mine, I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I had expected something triumphant, or maybe something sad. What I felt instead was something simpler and harder to name. It was the feeling of being in the right place after a very long time of being needed rather than settled. The house smelled like her still. I don't know how that was possible 4 months after she passed, except that places hold people in ways we don't fully understand. The particular soap she used, the cedar smell from the hall closet, something underneath it all, that was just the house being itself, being hers, being the place where she had spent a decade living as fully as she could manage. I made coffee in her kitchen. I stood at her window and looked at her backyard. The bird feeder she had always kept filled, now empty, which I would need to fill again. The rosebush along the fence that nobody had tended to in months and needed serious attention. The small garden patch where she used to grow tomatoes, just weeds now. I had things to do. There would always be things to do. The notebook was on the kitchen table. I had set it there the night before, after unpacking my car, and I had looked at it for a long time before I went to bed. This morning I looked at it again. I didn't open it. I didn't need to open it anymore. Everything it contained had been said and heard and accounted for. It had done what it needed to do. Now it was just a leather-covered collection of pages, worn at the corners, with Mom's name on the inside flap. I picked it up and carried it to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand. The same spot where it had always been, the same spot where I had found it after she passed. It belonged there. Then I went back to the kitchen, poured my coffee, and started making a list of everything I needed to do to bring the backyard back to life. People called me greedy. Not just Denise. Before the meeting, in the weeks after Mom passed, when word got out among relatives and family friends that there might be some complexity with the estate, people took sides the way they always do, based on the story they were told first. Denise told her story first. She was good at telling stories. She had spent a long time building the version of herself she wanted people to see. And I was the older sister who had been there every day, who apparently, according to that story, must have had an angle, must have been working towards something, must have been quietly arranging things behind the scenes, while Denise was just trying to maintain her own life far away. People find it easier to believe that a person who benefits must have been working for the benefit. It removes the discomfort of acknowledging that someone can simply do hard things out of love and not out of calculation. I didn't go around correcting the story. I didn't post anything. I didn't call relatives to explain. I had spent 6 years not performing my love for our mother, and I wasn't about to start performing my righteousness now. I just continued. I fixed the bird feeder, I pruned the rose bush, I ordered soil for the garden patch. I went back to work at the hospital 2 weeks after the estate meeting and started the process of rebuilding the parts of my own life I had put aside during the caregiving years. The financial review resolved itself in the months that followed. Denise made a repayment arrangement. I don't know the details. I wasn't involved. Mr. Hargrove handled it. Denise and I are not close. I don't know if we ever will be, but she calls now, more than she did before. The calls are short and not easy, but they are real in a way that the holiday calls never quite were. Maybe that's Mom's last gift, not the house, not the legal outcome, but the forced honesty, the removal of the story that had allowed both of us to keep the distance we had. I don't know where it goes from here. But I know what I did, and I know who I am, and I know that when it mattered most, the truth didn't need me to defend it. It just needed someone to read it out loud. And I was right there. If you've ever been called the villain, simply for showing up, subscribe. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need defending. It just needs a voice.